Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles, host of the Angelo Robles podcast on iHeart, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, and other platforms. I'm also the founder and CEO of FamilyOffice Association, a global membership organization dedicated to the interest of incredible families and their family offices. As many of you know, I've been incredibly active during COVID, and this summer, having a chance to interview all of my, and I'm not saying this to brag, and I'm not saying I got dozens of them, there's only a finite number of them, but my $10 billion families, mainly the heads of their family office, about what keeps them up at night, what are they concerned about? And this goes into the research that I do, the consultative practice that I've evolved within FOA, as well as my master classes. And our website is very descriptive. It's completely updated on all of that, FamilyOfficeAssociation.com. But it looks like a lot of it comes back to, Angelo, we already have the castle. We want to have a great moat around that castle. And there's no one simple strategy. It's a collective of often dozens. It's complex. It's intertwined. So we're titling today's session, How the World's Greatest Family Dynasties Protect Their Wealth. Let me give you a little bit of context. Family offices need to deeply question their assumptions about ownership of assets, including digital assets, portfolio management, asset allocation practices where wealth preservation and wealth transfer, as well as asset provenance, I guess I'll call it, verification, authentication, attestation, attribution, and identity can be forensically proven. So wealth management and risk associated with the governance and compliance and regulatory and sovereign and cyber risk are mitigated and prevented. Again, I've always said the main job at that level we're talking about is to solve problems and help the family procure positive future outcomes. I've always said you could be right as an executive 96% of the time, and you think you're doing a great job, but it's relative to the 4% of the time that you're not. If the impact of being wrong is devastating to the portfolio, the family, then all they're going to remember is that 4% of the time where the one black swan thing happened. So it's really, really important. Our special guest today is Jim Blom, Global Family Advisor and advisor to Ocean Studio. Let me give you a little bit of context about Jim. He has a deep background in tech as a seasoned tech executive advising family offices and boards, often specializing in corporate development expertise in data center, blockchain, cloud, software industry as an investor and advisor since 1995. His background is incredibly strong in supply chain data, financial security, software, and telecom. Jim, it is truly a pleasure and an honor to have you on. Welcome.
Thank you, my friend.
Well, let's get right to it because I really did quite the build-up there. There's no way that we could cover everything we're going to want to cover in an hour or an hour and 10 minutes, which means we'll have to have you on again and again, and I very much look forward to that. Why don't I start by my perspective a little broadly? How do we, from a risk management, risk mitigation, and governance perspective, forensically prove we own the physical and digital assets we hold and prove the assets are ours and that we have clear title to them?
I think that is such a great question, and a question that I often like to ask a lot of the ultra high net worth teams and the single family office and multifamily office teams to really investigate. And I think the one thing that most people are familiar with in this audience, as well as in the practice of the space, is they're pretty much exposed to exceptional talent in the cybersecurity and, shall I say, data security and cybersecurity perspective. Out here in California, there's just been a lot of great people from the military and the DoD that have made their way out to the West Coast to basically inform people about state-of-the-art systems. And what I would say is the way we do that is we approach it from a systems level. And so there's a human component, there's a cultural component, And there's obviously a technology and expertise component, but most people don't have that full view on how to train. And coming to something that you've talked about before about having a chief learning officer at the family offices, the number one way to address these challenges is to have subject matter experts at the table who actually are the best in class in each of their respective domains. So you can't just have a privacy expert. You can't just have a data security expert. You can't just have a kernel expert, somebody who's really amazing at building operating systems and operating systems kernel. You have to have people at the cascade around the systems level of computing and infrastructure and technology and software, and who understand virtualization and containerization who've been doing it for decades. And those people generally have been doing it for decades, and many of them come from very well-known public companies. And so many of the family offices and across the family office community, they are getting better at essentially sharing and informing each other about best practices around that risk, and understanding how they truly assess what is theirs and what they can prove is theirs and what they can forensically then prove in a court of law. And so that means you must have governance, risk, and compliance teams. You must have tax and audit teams. You should have intellectual property talent from some of the best firms. Some of the best firms on the East Coast are exceptionally strong because they come from DoD backgrounds, who've been running intellectual property practices, who are actually become experts over a decade in intangible asset management. And so at the end of the day, family offices are in the asset management business, and it's all about wealth preservation. And so you have to have the IP talent that is around, that actually comes from the DoD and comes from the state-of-the-art technology companies, where they've actually practiced and built, and shall we say, defended system-level networks and system-level infrastructure. And so I think that's the kind of caliber of talent you need around the table to assess those risks and to help guide you through the process and learn as an organization, because of the culture, because of the amount of talent and teams you have around. Does that make sense?
It makes more sense than I would even realize. Of course it does. And these are some of the things that I talk about in engaging with families. If you're not going to do it right, be rigorous and institutional and strive for excellence, not mediocrity, then in my opinion, just don't have a single family office. It's not worth the time, effort. You're better off just outsourcing everything. And that's okay. I'm not saying that that's the wrong perspective. But if you want the ultimate in privacy, control, and customization, and you're really concerned about that moat around the castle, then doing it right and having an institutional level family office where you're spending the money, you have the breadth of resources, is going to be the way to go. Now, we're going to have a very encompassing conversation today, everyone. And again, this is probably worthy of one of my 4 to 6 hour masterclasses. So we're going to cover a lot. Maybe not a lot super deep over the next approximate hour. We will be getting into investing. We will be getting into the value of earlier stage VC investing and why that's important for generational wealth. So we have a lot of things to kind of unpack, if I could overuse an overused word. Why don't I get to my second more formal question? Given wealth preservation is a core objective of these billionaire family offices, one of the questions everyone must ask is how concentrated are the risks that we hold per country, which we don't discuss enough about here in the US, per currency, and effectively an asset allocation model.
Absolutely. Angela, is there a question that you wanted me to address specifically around that? Yeah.
So the latter part, I said, assessing the concentrated risk that many significant families have. And I specifically noted 3 things. The first one that I noted was per country. A most common example, and then I'll let you run with it, is here in the US, many families tend to be very dedicated. And there's lots of reasons to be proud and patriotic to be an American. It's an amazing country. It's beautiful. It has tremendous resources. It has contract law. I don't know where to end. It's a great list that truly is amazing. But we maybe get a little blind to the fact that things change. I gave you the example of one of my families said, Angelo, the odds of chaos, come on. Pre-COVID, 0.001%. And now with what I see going on with unemployment, with fiscal irresponsibility to all the challenges we're having from an unrest perspective in Seattle and Portland, his words, I now put the odds at 3 to 5%, which is enough for me to hedge against and leaves me concerned. Generally, do Americans invest overly concentrated, public, private real estate, and don't realize their risk and greater optionality they would have to be more globally diversified?
I think Angela, the points you've raised are incredibly important. One of the things that many groups of people who grew up overseas, were born overseas, and may have made their way to the United States, since the 40s, they came to the U.S. because they came during a period of great disruption and change, and even war. And so what I can say as a family my family went through that experience like many other families around the globe, and then in particular in the US, when you have to leave a country when you don't want to, and you have to lead at speed, you realize very quickly how incredible the United States of America is, first and foremost. Second, what you realize is the rule of law is an extraordinary asset. And so having that be afforded to you by mitigating your risk, by offsetting that concentration, and looking for other areas geographically in other countries that you feel can represent and from a governance, risk, and compliance, meet a lot of your core standards, like the United Kingdom. Maybe not ideal from a tax perspective, but the UK from a sovereignty perspective, given its structure in the city and the way they have structured many of their laws, affords many US investors, US residents, and then US citizens the opportunity to mitigate some of that risk. So geographically, that's an example of a country from a cultural perspective, legal perspective, governance, and then what I would say a framework around institutionally protecting wealth and preserving wealth. And risk management, the talent of the risk management teams in the City of London and surrounding the UK is exceptional. And then across the Commonwealth. So you see this kind of capability and talent and depth of practice from a tax audit perspective. In Singapore, you see this kind of talent in Toronto. You used to see a lot of it concentrated in Hong Kong. Obviously, people are realizing that, Hong Kong and all the assumptions they made, it probably doesn't meet many of their requirements around wealth preservation and sovereignty risk challenges that are going on there. So these are the kinds of reasons why you have great gravity of examples in the last year, where you can see how fundamentally the legal, governance, compliance, and sovereign challenges are cascading across the geographies that many family offices used to be afforded, and now are going to have to take more concentration. For US investors who have not actually made that decision to look at putting some of their physical assets, digital assets in other countries, some countries like the United Kingdom may afford them a lot of the perfect, shall we say, portfolio or ecosystem perspective that allows them access to the talent that they need. Because it's not just about the legal framework that you have in other countries, which are fantastic from a tax perspective, but then you have to live there. You have to be able to go there. You have to be able to do business there. You have to be able to culturally communicate. And then you have to have the ability to actually meet with people who are going to come and help you in a time of change. So these are the things that, from a cultural perspective, I see many people not really thinking through. They naturally gravitate towards the best tax and audit environment, and may not look at the reality of how easy it is to actually get there. So it's a classic resiliency question to answer that question, which is governance and risk around geographical concentration. I think is easy to offset if you put the right framework in place and surround yourself with the right talent. So I think that's a super place for most people to start. Then the question is, from a credit risk and currency risk perspective, if you just look at traditional portfolio management that all of the best advisors practice, and all of us know so many of these extraordinary, gifted, incredibly credible people who have significant assets under management. But single family offices and family offices in general in the US are, shall we say, over allocated to the US dollar and to the United States geographically and from a currency risk perspective. So you have to take a balanced approach, and you have to take a balanced approach that is weighted. And then you have to look at your risk profile and your risk tolerance. And then while you're working with the next generation, transfer that knowledge, transfer that best practice, and look at that over everyone's time horizon, because many people forget the time horizon part to the currency risk. How long do you want to hold that currency? Does that make sense for you to hold that currency? How can you get exposure to that currency through other assets? So these kinds of asset class concentration risks, and then asset allocation portfolio management tools that you can use to kind of take advantage and give yourself a more balanced approach and a more measured approach, I think that's profoundly important to do today.
Well, that's incredibly eloquent and well stated, and I completely concur. And yes, there are countries that families may want to consider owning assets, resources, income producing businesses, which I'm a big fan of for substantial families as part of that moat around the castle. And it's more than just taxation, but that's a part of it. But you're correct, from some of the countries you mentioned, Canada, the UK, Sweden, Switzerland, Australia, Singapore. There's others in LATAM, if I had to pick one, and I think there's grave challenges, but Uruguay probably has the best structure. They just don't have the military and other might and experiences that some of the other countries that I noted. And really only one or two of those countries that I noted are specifically good for taxes. Australia and Sweden are terrible from a tax perspective, although there's more loopholes and flexibility for income earned and assets offshore from those countries. But we don't want to make this an incredibly in-depth tax talk, or that gets very, very bogged down. But I think you get the picture. Besides keeping optionality open in more diverse countries and various income-producing real businesses, assets, and potentially currencies, diversifying away from the US dollar, the British pound, the Swiss mark. I mean, what are some that you would look towards as being a level of diversity that you should explore?
From a currency perspective, I'm partial to Switzerland across the board. So if you look at currency risk, one of the ways to offset it is if you look at many of the opportunities that are being afforded by digital currencies, and a lot of the work that's going on in central banking around digital currencies, you can see how you can be afforded the luxury of the geography and get the physical security of the Swiss monetary instruments, coupled with some of the digital asset management pools and captives that are available in a very structured way. So that's a nice way of saying that if someone were to ask me a very tough question, I would argue heavily that Switzerland is one of the best places to go and begin to learn and educate yourself about the next, shall we say, portfolio of central banking digital instruments that are moving into digital currency formation and digital currency, shall I say, policy. And you'll see that really well thought through in Switzerland. And you'll see the talent in Zurich, and you'll see the teams in ultra high net worth and family offices really technically deep in understanding how they prove a lot of the classic questions, which provenance, authentication, identity. How can I attest that that is what is happening with my 50 million in that position, and then that $200 million position, I can prove that that's mine digitally, physically, in any court, even The Hague if I have to go to The Hague. So you're just going to find that Switzerland is is really where some of the, not only the top investment banking, ultra high net worth family office teams are, but also that's where some of the deepest bench and tech around this area happen to live and work and have their companies. So I think you're going to start to see a lot of policy work there that I think is going to be mature enough, is the right word, the maturity for US very discrete and shall we say, extremely bright single family office teams, they can take the time and go and learn a lot, because the state of the art of central banking and digital currency is not the United States.
Correct. It's not. And you're correct, certainly from my experience about Switzerland, that I would perhaps argue for IP and talent and, their contract laws, certain Scandinavian countries as well. So you have mentioned digital assets, which is going to imply to people blockchain from a technology perspective, and we'll probably also get into a little bit of cryptocurrencies and the value that may provide to families as well. For all the reasons that you noted, the authentication, terrible at pronouncing that word, but you all get what I mean. It really creates something that can't be penetrated. It's true. And that's what makes it powerful. I don't want to make this a discussion you and I would know, but when you buy a public equity here in the US through a broker dealer, that it's held in the street name. And I'm 99.9% sure that's going to end up being okay, but it gets a little interesting, which is not going to be the point of our dialogue today. But if that was on blockchain, if that was digital, then that would make me, that extra 1/10 of 1% that I'm a little concerned about, would make me feel a lot better. Let's talk a little bit about the advent of blockchain and the dynamic changes that are occurring, and how some families have been very slow to the game, and how that could be very negatively impactful to their generational wealth.
Sure. So how if I put it to you this way? I would like your audience not to think about blockchain from an IRR, ROIC perspective. I would basically contend the number one, if there's nothing else you get from our discussion, is to absolutely spend the time, not from an investment return perspective, spend it to educate yourself on being able to understand what digital currency and digital wealth means. Because what will happen as you go deeply into the space, you will start to read material that will force you to question many of the fundamental underlying assumptions of what ownership is, and why it's so fantastic in the physical world, and why it's so tough in the digital world. And so what I will say is, I'll get specific. Data portability, data interoperability is very, very, very critical. In Germany and in Switzerland and Sweden, with the Estonians, with the help of the US Department of Defense, the US Department of Defense is extraordinary. Those teams were at the state of the art in this entire space back in 2012. How can I say that? I was there. I helped build one of these companies, and I'm still a shareholder in one of those companies. And what I can say is, you just need to go, if you do have a family office or you're the CEO of a family office, you need to assemble a team that really goes and seeks out the best talent in the world, who are literally on the patents, who've written the white papers, who are challenging a lot of the core assumptions that many of our most favorite investment opportunities in blockchain and those CEOs and entrepreneurs would espouse. What I'm trying to say is, don't fall in love with anyone from New York and Manhattan. Don't fall in love with everyone from the West Coast and Silicon Valley. The state of the art in blockchain is actually in places like Virginia, in Baltimore, in Estonia, and in Basel. So you've got to look at this from a distributed risk perspective and a systems perspective. You need to have information and knowledge that is not coming from one geography and not coming from one country or continent. And so if you get that very diverse opinion around some of your favorite assumptions around blockchain and all the derivatives around fintech, you'll get a very diverse opinion. And because of that diversity, you will actually be informed. And that's the key message.
Excellent. Changing directions a little bit, but it all kind of ties in.
Sure.
Along with liquidity, best practices, processes, security, integrity, authenticity, provenance, associated from an asset class and asset allocation risk score. I mean, that's a lot that we're talking about here. Coupled with my prior question, your response and what you just mentioned relative to, again, quote unquote, digital assets, and how many people tend to be very centered. Americans skew to this more than others of developed countries in their own country, that if you're concerned about mitigating risk and that 1% chance of something happening, but it's devastating, how do you weave and incorporate all of this together? How do you know who the best teams are? I'm assuming you're not necessarily bringing them in the SFO, you're outsourcing for their intellectual firepower. But if you don't know what you don't know, how do you know who the best of the best is?
Yeah, so this is why I take a very distributed approach to wealth management. You need to not have concentration where you live, which is normal and natural and human. So for instance, I happen to live in the San Francisco Bay Area. Most everyone in my community, including myself, makes the same mistake. We go to all the people we know, we go to the people who are close to us, who went to school with us, who built businesses together, and from the private equity and venture capital and family office community. Well, generally, that's who's surrounding you. So what I would say is, if you have $1 billion to $2 billion under management and you're looking at a generational change, you should look at interviewing private wealth teams that are in the best offices out of New York and Connecticut and New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Chicago. Meaning, get that geographic, shall we say, spread and go put to work. Maybe not. You have to be very, very gradual about how you deploy capital and who you deploy capital with. So that's really critical. But you do need to take, one of the risks you need to embrace is to build in a plan that's over time allows you to mitigate the risk of one asset manager. Having all your assets with one family office entity and advisor, well, you're just going to be missing out on that diversified opinion. And so that's my approach to this space. Example, if you're with Morgan Stanley, it makes a lot of sense to have a great team from any other global institutional bank that you have been, shall we say, exposed to, and go see if you can meet the best people who run those offices and those teams. And they're obviously, that information is public. Barron's is a super, super, super tool. So is the Family Office Association. Everyone knows the talent that's out there. And what I would say is just spend the time and invest the time in interviewing people and get to know the people who run these teams and pick people who've been in the business for 20 to 30 years.
Excellent. My next is kind of a combination commentary question. I wrote it down. It's rather long, so just stay with me. I think it weaves a lot of the context regarding what we're talking about.
Sure.
I guess another key question is to ensure, is deeply asked, is there alignment, Jim, across the family office advisors, meaning principals, owners, founders, on risk across asset classes and allocation, along with documented and well-communicated plan on the time horizons and assumptions behind the strategy, ensuring there is a clear and transparent process for addressing, along with concrete objectives around purpose, mission, targets, are critical given geopolitical, national, social, environmental, financial, healthcare risk, which are, from a systematic perspective, must be better assessed given the lack of resiliency and sustainability that we currently see worldwide.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the point that I think must be said is you have to assume that I'll state this differently. If you didn't like software in tech in 2000 because the market did not perform the way you wanted it to, and you didn't have the outcome that you wanted, and you stayed away, you could argue that you missed one of the greatest opportunities in the last 100 years. So you can't fall in love with technology. What you have to fall in love with is understanding the principles behind that technology and what is happening. And that doesn't mean you deploy capital into it. You have to go and study it. And then if you have the right time horizon over a 10-year period, you can get comfortable with taking some level of risk and allocating a portion of your capital to learn. And if you look at it from a learning perspective, you would have eventually found your way into some of the better performing publicly held equities in history. And everybody, I can say this to a fact, I don't know anyone in the country who will say, I bought Apple at whatever the lowest price was on the worst day. And I bought it at scale, meaning I put it in absolute extraordinary position in Apple, like I used to have in 3M or Union Pacific, whatever the company, meaning the asset classes that make you uncomfortable, like potentially digital fintech and blockchain and hyperledger plays and digital currency may frighten you, but you have to invest the time and the money to go educate yourself so that you can start to assign some portion of that capital that you have in your portfolio that's extremely weighted and very minor, and assign it at a learning score. So you have to do that. And if you don't, you'll never have a big enough position ever, and you'll miss every move because you can't time these things. So you couldn't have timed cloud, you couldn't have timed telecom, you couldn't have timed the internet play, you couldn't have timed SaaS, so you couldn't have timed AI. So these are movements that happen very, very quickly, and because they happen very quickly, you'll see you may not get in early, but at least you'll learn. And so then you'll learn to get comfortable with the risk. And I think that's the message. Getting comfortable with risk and then allocating the right capital with the right manager who can take the risk, who's a subject matter expert. That's a great strategy in a very balanced, sustained way, which becomes resilient.
Well, that effectively, and families of great wealth generationally have been investing in entrepreneurs, and we're going to call that effectively VC investing.
Sure.
So part of the challenge that I see here in the US, even for billion-dollar families, is the VC industry tends to be very concentrated in the top, let's call them 15 to 20 firms. And some of them don't even take in new capital if you're not an institutional investor with $100 million or more. And even then, they may not want you as a first-time family office in their fund. So that question is, how do you get access? Do you have no choice but to accept higher fees and potentially go through a fund-to-fund? Or is there another approach to get diversity in from blockchain to AI to what's evolving in the community? That could be the next big thing.
What I'll say without question is the ultra high net worth teams in the United States are exceptional. And the peer of peers know who are exceptional. So those teams are extraordinary and exceptional, and they will know how to help you assess which venture firms map to your own risk and risk tolerance, because each one of them culturally has a very, very unique style to investing and to taking risk. And so you have to decide, are you really an early stage investor? Very few institutional single family offices are comfortable with seed stage investing. Some are, but the majority are not. So it all starts with basically your risk profile, and then your ultra high net worth teams and their risk profile, and then your alignment around that in picking active managers who are venture capital founders that map to your goals. And if you can't get allocation, because what you're talking about is my favorite part of the whole day, is allocation. You never can get allocation to the best teams. You have to build them, which means if you want to build the best teams, you have to actually invest in creating a portfolio effect with other family offices and create an MFO and go out with ultra high net worth teams and interview the next generation of great venture capitalists. And they're being, shall we say, taught, and they're learning every day. Back in 2000, many of the best teams that came out in 2005 and 2010 with the best early stage venture firms, a lot of them came from Summit. So people in the ultra high net worth teams knew this. They knew that talent was being groomed. And Summit was one of the places where that talent was being groomed. And turns out Summit, shall I say, from the Summit family, from that world and that training and that experience, they created some of the best early stage firms. So if you're a single family office or a private wealth, you're a family that's beginning that journey of creating that large family office, you should look at creating your own venture firm, potentially if that aligns with your risk profile and the next generation that you're going to transfer that wealth to. And if that makes sense and the values are aligned, whether that be, what I say, an ESG focused or purpose with profit focused fund, you have to find the right risk alignment with the right cultural alignment and the point of why you're deploying that capital. And what are you comfortable with? Meaning, what do you know? And if you don't know what you're investing in and you're investing behind managers and you don't know what they're investing in, it's probably not a good fit. So it's like anything, there's something for everyone out there, and you can find the quality. The quality stands apart because it's in the math. The math will always tell you where the best managers are, but you have to be in there early. So my message to anyone who has a $2 to $10 billion family office, if you haven't started a venture firm, go meet with family offices who have and what they've learned, and meet with their ultra high net worth advisors and learn from them and see what lessons they learned. And I can say this because this is not theoretical to me. This is what my own, I'm very fortunate that I have a family that it was very hardworking, and we were very lucky to meet one of those young asset managers. And so I can say, with direct knowledge here, you can't pick one. You have to go meet the whole class, shall we say, this whole vintage of the latest and greatest young men and women who are coming out and creating venture firms.
I think that's amazing insight that you just gave for probably a multi-billion-dollar family to effectively create their own VC. And if they're smaller than that, they may be able to do it on lesser scale, but an option is they combine the resources with several other families and be the true definition of a multi-family office. Even though they'll have to register, there's ways they could structure as a private trust company as well, but there'll be a level of regulation, and that's okay. I do completely agree. I've been speaking about all summer about for these families to create offshore banking entities and reinsurance companies. I won't bore the audience with my granular detail on that, but I've been thinking about VC because of earlier stage investment access. I think it's great. My question to you is, what's a minimum commitment? So let's say we could roll back the clock to the early 2000s and you identify a rising talent inside of Summit in their late 20s, early 30s that maybe is part of a group or team. For you to pull them out as a family office, this is sounding a little bit like what Sid Bass did with Richard Rainwater as a 26-year-old at Goldman Sachs. But there's only so many stories of that grand slam. What would you need to offer in terms of co-invest? It would need to be very attractive, possibly more than 2 and 20, but there could be various golden handcuffs and benefits around that, and direct investment into companies they pick out. But I'm going to think you better come to the table where probably minimum, what do you think, 200 or 300 million to deploy into a diverse group of companies beyond early seed stage, a little bit more earlier VC stage, and you're going to have millions of dollars in cost relative to embedding that team in your family office or keeping it separate. I mean, this is going to take a lot of money.
Yeah, well, what I would say is most first-time funds, the risk management best practices, you need to have between 20 and 30 to be an anchor LP. And sometimes there are investors out there who want a piece of the GP, the general partnership, and the best venture capitalists who are forming their best venture capital firms won't let someone who's an anchor LP own a piece of the GP.
Yes.
And when they do that, they attract greater capital from more sophisticated and more what I would call institutionally aware and strong institutional investors over time. And so what I would say is, for an SFO, you need to be ready to commit to $20 million check sizes almost every 2 to 3.5 years. And the reason why, so you need to go in knowing that if you're going to go create a firm, you're going to need to be able to afford them the luxury of working with Gunderson Dettmer, one of the greatest firms in history and partnerships in history. They've just done an extraordinary job. And there's many incredible firms out there, but just to use Gunderson as an example, Gunderson, a big hurdle for many extraordinary venture capitalists who are raising their first time fund, well, it's the legal costs. And so you have to have, as a family office, you have to understand that that is a hurdle rate for these extraordinary, talented individuals. And then the second issue is they have to bring their own capital often. And many of them are in a point in life where maybe that's not the ideal thing for them to do. So you have to be ready to carry and be proud being a founding member, but in a very, shall we say, institutional way where you offset all the classic financial, legal, governance, tax challenges and resources that are required to launch a world-class fund that is going to be around for a long time. So you have to be that kind of an LP. And if you're not, then you need to find another SFO or another MFO that can bring that to bear to help them. Meaning you're almost incubating. That's the wrong word because it gives you the sense that there's not that fiduciary responsibility. You really do have a fiduciary responsibility if you're going to ask them to change their careers, to create their own fund. Even though they're the ones who are taking on that risk, you have to know that that responsibility, it may not be incumbent, but you may not understand it, but you should seek to understand what that means so that you can give them every chance as a first-time fund to get off. And as most seasoned family offices and ultra high net worth individuals know from investing in venture, and when you invest in a first-time fund, there's a lot of learning, meaning they're underwater for a little while. So you have to be ready to deploy and have that capital call. So you really shouldn't go in with thinking that you're going to deploy less than $60 million is the way I like to look at it.
Yes, when you have the diversity that you're talking about.
Be an anchor LP, yeah.
Which kind of leads me taking this all into kind of an ultimate question around the family security and safety, in additional to wealth preservation and family office financial sustainability and liquidity, very important. These need to be asked and debated and reflected upon in its context. We already discussed to some degree, again, it's worthy of hours of discussion. We did it in 3 or 4 minutes, sovereign risk. We spoke a little bit about currency risk. We didn't talk too much about, and there's so many risks out there. And again, I could argue the number one goal of the family office, again, is to mitigate and hedge against risk, to procure more positive future outcomes. Cyber risk, identity, confidentiality, privacy. Some of this could be addressed through proper contractual arrangements with the family, their executives, and the advisors. That doesn't always mean it's honored. Some of it could be addressed through IP and domicile, Switzerland, Scandinavia, some level of diversity. But this gets really, really deep. And I don't know how much into the rabbit hole we want to go. But if you're wealthy, you are a target, and don't think that they don't know about you. You are a target for cyber criminals. You're potentially, depending on what country you're in, you're a target for your own government. That could probably
assume, yeah, Angelo, I just love where you're going, and I apologize. You can see how excited I am about having this conversation. The number one risk every family office faces is cyber risk. Number one. Without question. And so that's, sorry, I didn't know if my connection was not being wonderful to both of us. It is the number one challenge. And I would say education around taking a holistic approach to cyber risk. You need to have some of the best people from that industry and that practice. And so the great news is there's an extraordinary amount of companies that you can hire who provide consulting, who come from the public equity world, who have gone public, and who are out there. So we've never had more talent with more software, with more teams that have more depth of experience, and they have the pedigree that you would expect. And the great news is we also have dedicated venture funds who have the same pedigreed individuals who have extraordinary expertise in cyber. And so you cannot underinvest enough and in team talent and advice from that community. And so I would say if you are going to have a family office that is going to be sustainable and resilient and be there for the next 2 to 3, a multi-generational approach and plan, you absolutely have to have that at the center of the plan next to the cultural alignment and timing of wealth transfer. So as much as family offices fail at wealth transfer, they also are going to fail disproportionately at wealth protection through, shall we say, the advent of cyber terrorism and cyber criminals and cyber attacks.
No question. And that's getting worse. It's not getting better. The bad guys are really, really smart. They appear to be drawing more people into that because I guess it's lucrative. And the issues that we spoke about really owning the asset and titling, become really important when there's incredibly intellectual, talented bad guys and cyber criminals out there that could wreak tremendous havoc and are usually steps ahead of 98% of most family offices. They sometimes just don't have the capacity. That's what holds them back a little bit. And we're not even getting into, and again, want to be careful about opening up the can of worms, but relative to governments having subpoena access to cloud and information should they want it. And then that relates a little bit to IP, to servers offshore, to Switzerland, Sweden, et cetera. But again, we could do a deeper dive into any one of a number of these subjects upcoming in the future. I would like to get your opinion, because you have mentioned digital and blockchain and effectively advancements from technology perspective. What do you think, and does it depend on your domicile and your own country's currency if you're a wealthy family, about cryptocurrencies, about Bitcoin? What's your opinion?
Yeah, I think, I believe that the way you mitigate risk is through information and knowledge and acquiring knowledge. And so to me, the number one way to address what you just raised is to have a distributed approach. So great example. If you're concerned about your digital assets, you need to have a team that is focused on understanding the state of the art of data storage. And so go pick one of the top 50 companies that can tell you about how amazing they are at data storage. So, we can have a podcast where I can list my top 50, my top 25, my top 10, but there are extraordinary entrepreneurs from around the world that are exceptional. And data storage is an area where most family offices do not understand the state of the art of data storage. And if you do, you're going to get really, really well informed, which is going to give you a lot of, shall we say, comfort in knowing you have many different options. And so the question is, if you handle your data and store it using technology that's come out in the last 24, 48 months, you're going to do really well, better than others who have a less than well-informed approach to this challenge. How about if I just say it that way?
Yes, I would agree. We're doing quite the big information overload for many people.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I mean that in a good way, but for family principals, for executives on the line, or will hear this in the family office, or even those that service the family office, I almost wonder if some of them are shaking their head like, wow, I didn't know about all this. It's really scary, as opposed to trying to take a first step. I'll deal with this next year. And procrastination is very common. One of the interesting things about COVID and working remotely, and this applied to me, is we get comfortable. We all fall prey to this. So I'm not singling anyone out. It happened to me. We get comfortable, and then something rocks our world. And what was going to take 5 or 10 years to evolve, we have to do it now. We have to work remotely. I need to be better at communication, project management, technology, AI, big data. And I found out, as most of the big families I spoke to this summer that I referenced earlier, I should have done this years ago. It wasn't that hard. But they do have to take the first step. We're throwing so much at them that unless we're hand-holding, consulting step by step, you at least have to be aware of these as being challenges, and how do you then look at it and how do you develop best practices? And I think, like you said, if you're a wealthy family with an SFO, your family office, they don't need to be able to be experts on that internally, or you don't need to bring that in internal, but they should have the level of Rolodex within their banking, accounting, legal, and other relationships to understand who is the best of the best, how could we meet them, and how we could engage. Would you agree that simply how you eat an elephant is one bite at a time, even though it looks daunting.
Yes, absolutely. I like to use history to help. The world's first central bank, Sweden. Do you think Sweden is very good at risk management? Absolutely. Do you think they have some of the best law firms in the world? Absolutely. Do they understand how to actually deal with transfer between intercorporate, complex, multi-continental level transactions? Absolutely. So Sweden as a country, from their legal, tax, audit, global multinational CEOs, their extraordinary education, their sophistication around technology, their humility and approach to understanding I don't know what I don't know, so I seek to know, and I want to set up this research institute, this lab, this foundation. That's the approach you have to take. And you can't get it done in 5 years. So the number one thing I like to say is to respond, Angela, to what you said, because it's profound. You have to have a 10-year plan. You have to have a 20-year plan. You have to have a 30-year plan. And you have to revisit the plan that you put in place, because 10 years goes like that. And so the challenge for many people is the pace of change, and the information and complexity is increasing. So the only way you can mitigate the risks around those challenges is you work with other family offices, and you coordinate and you share. And if you do that, that's actually how the best cybersecurity teams are working in Germany, in the UK, and the US, is they're sharing. So you have to start with the fundamental assumption: you're never going to get comfortable with the unknown, and you're never going to get comfortable with things that are going to blind you or come out of nowhere. What you have to get comfortable with is what is your risk tolerance for loss, and at what level will you lose, and what does that model look like? It's around the models, and then the practices, and the reality of actually operationally addressing those risks. Meaning, if you have resources and assets deployed in Europe, in countries that have very extraordinary favorable tax statuses, well, right now they're not going to be very helpful because you can't actually fly there. So that's no good. So well done. So does that same team have a team in Toronto? And does that team in Toronto, are they very tight with that team in that country, that very tiny country? There's a couple countries that are really super tiny. They're really good at managing money for ultra high net worth individuals. Good news, Toronto probably has those people. So you have to go look culturally at what is your ability to get into a transportation asset and get to the place you need to be, to meet with the people you need to be, to assess that risk and make a decision. So.
No, that was excellent. My little commentary, because I did mention Sweden from my perspective of being a very intriguing country and one where it could be valuable. My two problems, meant to be a little tongue in cheek: sunshine or lack thereof, and income taxes. But again, there's some ways to potentially mitigate against that.
Taxes are great because it means you have an asset. If you can't get to
That's
the people,
a positive way to look at it,
and you're not liquid, and you can't call someone to get you out of a bad position, and you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you could lose.
Right, for sure. Now, the other one, and as we take it to the home stretch,
Sure.
And I guess this is a sovereign risk, but you'll let me know. In this country, 1933, I might be a year off, FDR said it's no longer proper for an individual to own gold. We're setting the price. You have to turn it in. If you don't, you're breaking the law. I don't care who you are. You could go to jail.
Yep.
Not only could that happen at the stroke of a politician's pen to gold again, there's no reason why that can't happen to cryptocurrencies, because we do have to report as a U.S. citizen. So they, unless we're not being honest on that, they know if we own it. Governments effectively have the ultimate control, don't they? Which is probably why diversity around the world is the only true answer.
This is my favorite comment. Can you predict what a government will do? No, but is it likely that all the governments around the world are going to seize everything you have at the same time? Now, I'm going to share a fun story. My family was one of those families that missed across the board. They had their ships in Germany at the wrong time. Then the ships that they didn't have in Germany that were seized by the German government were then bombed in Norway. Uh-oh. The other ships happened to be on the North Atlantic. Uh-oh. They lost those ships too.
Oh my
The
God.
ships that they had in Singapore, the Japanese took. So that, So I came from a normal family that worked for many, many hundreds of years to get to a point where they actually were ship owners. And in less a period of 5 years, they lost every single ship. And the ships that weren't sunk or the ships that weren't bombed were actually taken by the government to go fight a war. So great news is I'm very proud of most of the governments around the world. They did a super job. They taught everybody in my family that hard work and education is the way to go. So all you have is your family, your health, and your education and your knowledge and your ability to assume you're always at risk. So accept risk, embrace risk, teach risk management, practice it, socialize, and meet other people who've learned lessons. And anyone who's great at risk will tell you they're not really great at it, but here's some things that they've failed less at. That's the approach to take. And that's the message I would leave your audience.
That's a fantastic ending message. And so excited to have had you on and very much look forward to our future work and collaboration and being a guest upcoming, because there's so much to discover and unpack in what you said that I very much look forward to it. For those that would have an interest in learning, if you desire, about you and your enterprises, your advisory work, your consulting work, how could they learn more about you and reach out?
I would recommend that they reach out to you, Angelo, and the Family Office Association. And I think that's a great place to start because of the extraordinary groups of families and resources you have around them. And I would welcome the opportunity to answer any questions they have.
Well, you're very kind. I'm going to put a little bit of a caveat to that because it may get released as a wider distribution YouTube or podcast. In theory, anyone could download it. I am going to be a little bit discretionary. So if you have an inquiry and I want to learn a little bit more about that inquiry, realize Jim's incredibly busy and I'm just helping to manage his time from that perspective. So just a little bit of a heads up there. On my concluding note, I really, really enjoy this. This is a subject that I just utterly love, among my favorites. And I think most important, what I keep on referring to as you own the castle if you're this kind of family, you need that moat. Well, I guess I could argue you could have multiple castles and moats in various jurisdictions, but we'll leave that comment out. I am Angelo Robles. I'm the host of the Angelo Robles podcast. I'm the founder and CEO at Family Office Association. We're a global membership organization dedicated to families of great wealth and their single family offices. We provide unique proprietary content, significant and deep content around many of the issues that we spoke about today with Jim. We host global programming, now digital, almost daily, so hundreds of times a year, sometimes peer-to-peer, sometimes with great experts like Jim. We're incredibly active. We're busier than ever during COVID-19, and we're more global and digital, speaking of some of the things we spoke about today, with our families around the world more than ever before. Our new website, it's the same URL, but outlines all that we provide from a consultative perspective and a membership perspective, and simply that's FamilyOfficeAssociation.com. Our YouTube channel, where we have some videos that we give to the public, I guess you could say. That simply is Family Office on YouTube. And again, my email would be angelo@FamilyOfficeAssociation.com. Jim, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you to our live audience. I very much look forward to the next time. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much, Angelo. Thank you.
My pleasure. Bye.
Privilege. Bye-bye. Cheers.